Dawn breaks over the Horn of Africa with a thin, colorless light. In the Italian camp, officers step from their tents and unfold maps already creased by certainty. Lines drawn in ink promise roads that do not exist, supply routes that assume obedience, and a battle yet to be fought that has already been decided, at least on paper. Rifles are cleaned, artillery crews stand ready, and the air carries the quiet confidence of an empire arriving late to a world it believes has already been claimed. Somewhere beyond the ridges, unseen and underestimated, another army is awake, moving, and waiting. In Europe, this scene feels familiar. By the final decades of the 19th century, the map of Africa is being erased and redrawn in foreign capitals. Borders are negotiated in rooms thousands of miles away, with rulers who will never see the terrain they divide. The language used is technical, almost polite. Protectorates, spheres of influence, civilizing missions, but the assumption beneath it is blunt and unchallenged. European power, armed with industry and modern weapons, is considered decisive by definition. Resistance may be brave, even tragic, but it is not expected to succeed. Italy enters this scramble, burdened by something the older empires no longer feel: insecurity. Unified only a generation earlier, it is a nation still proving itself, watching Britain and France accumulate prestige overseas while Germany asserts itself on the continent. Colonial expansion becomes a way to announce arrival, to claim a seat among the established powers. North Africa is already crowded. Ethiopia, independent and diplomatically active, stands out on the map not as an equal, but as an opportunity. From the Italian perspective, the logic appears straightforward. Eritrea has already been secured along the Red Sea. The highlands beyond are difficult, but not impassable. Ethiopian society is described in reports as divided, feudal, and technologically backward. The assumption follows naturally. Modern European organization will compensate for distance, terrain, and numbers. It is a belief reinforced by decades of victories elsewhere, where columns of disciplined troops and artillery have overwhelmed far larger forces. Adwa, though not yet named, is already imagined as another confirmation of a rule no one expects to be broken. If you're watching closely, stay with this moment. Like and subscribe, not as a pause, but as a promise, because by the end of this story, you'll see how one battle dismantled an assumption that had shaped an entire century, and why the confidence unfolding here will soon echo far beyond this valley, in ways no one in this camp can yet imagine. The men writing these reports rarely consider the land itself as an active force. Northern Ethiopia is treated as an obstacle to be crossed, not a system to be understood. Mountains rise sharply, cutting visibility and fragmenting movement. Narrow paths favor those who know them. Distance is deceptive. What looks close on a map can take days to traverse on foot. Supply lines stretch thin, dependent on animals, and routes vulnerable to disruption. These are logistical details, not strategic threats, at least in the minds of those planning the campaign. Back in Rome, politics sharpen the edge of expectation. Colonial success is meant to quiet domestic criticism and rally national pride. Newspapers speak of destiny and progress. Parliamentary debates frame the Ethiopian campaign as inevitable, even necessary. A decisive victory would not only secure territory, but validate Italy's claim to modernity itself. Failure, though rarely spoken aloud, would be more than a military setback. It would call into question the story Italy is telling about its place in the world. What is missing from this narrative is Ethiopia, not as a symbol, but as a state. In European imagination, Africa is often rendered as empty space or passive terrain, awaiting administration. Ethiopia disrupts that image quietly, persistently, and inconveniently. It sends diplomats abroad, negotiates treaties, purchases weapons, and plays rival powers against one another. It does not announce itself as a challenge to empire. It simply refuses to disappear. Italian officers on the ground are not ignorant of this entirely. Some reports note the growing size of Ethiopian forces, the presence of modern rifles, the difficulty of controlling the interior. But these observations are filtered through a deeper conviction that experience has never contradicted, that European command, training, and technology will ultimately prevail. Numbers can be managed, geography can be overcome, resistance can be broken. The question is not whether Italy will win, but how quickly. As preparations continue, the campaign begins to take on a momentum of its own. Decisions made months earlier harden into assumptions that cannot easily be revised. To question them would be to question the premise of empire itself. Orders move down the chain of command, carrying with them the weight of expectation from Rome, from Europe, from an entire imperial system accustomed to being obeyed by the world it measures. The irony, still invisible, is that this confidence is being mirrored across the highlands, not as arrogance, but as resolve. Ethiopia is not preparing to make a statement to Europe. It is preparing to defend itself. The difference matters. One side advances to confirm a belief. The other mobilizes to preserve a reality it already knows. By the time Italian columns begin to move inland, the myth of supremacy is no longer abstract. It is embodied in boots on rocky ground, in artillery dragged across ridges, in maps that simplify what cannot be simplified. The machinery of empire rolls forward, not recklessly, but assuredly, convinced that history itself is on its side. What none of these men can yet see is that history, for once, is about to hesitate. The Ethiopian highlands do not announce themselves with grandeur. They rise quietly, layer upon layer, ridges folding into one another until distance loses meaning. Villages cling to slopes, paths curve where maps insist on straight lines, and the land rewards familiarity more than force. Here, power has never belonged to those who arrive suddenly. It belongs to those who endure, adapt, and wait. At the center of this endurance stands Menelik II, not as a romantic figure, but as a ruler shaped by decades of calculation. He has survived internal rivals, shifting alliances, and the pressure of foreign powers that approach Ethiopia not as a partner, but as a prize. By the 1890s, Menelik governs an empire that understands the modern world far better than Europe assumes. He reads its intentions through treaties, its rivalries through diplomats, and its weaknesses through the weapons it is willing to sell. Ethiopia's strength does not come from rejecting modernity, but from selecting it. European rifles flow into the highlands through ports controlled by competing colonial powers, each more interested in undercutting Italy than in restricting Ethiopian access. Menelik purchases arms in volume, not as a symbolic gesture, but as policy. Gras rifles, Remingtons, and artillery pieces are distributed through a network of regional leaders who owe allegiance not just to the crown, but to the survival of the state itself. Modern firepower is not centralized in one elite force. It is woven into an older system of mobilization that can summon tens of thousands of fighters across vast distances. This is where European observers misread Ethiopia most profoundly. They see a society they label feudal and assume fragmentation. What they miss is cohesion under pressure. Loyalty in Ethiopia is layered, not absent, rooted in land, faith, and obligation, and activated when external threat becomes unmistakable. When Menelik calls, the response is not hesitant. It is overwhelming. Beside him stands Empress Taitu, whose influence is neither ceremonial nor hidden. She understands European diplomacy with a clarity sharpened by suspicion. Where Italian envoys speak of protection and friendship, she hears erasure. It is Taitu who pushes hardest against compromise, who insists that sovereignty is not something to be translated loosely or deferred for convenience. Her counsel anchors Menelik's caution with resolve, ensuring that patience does not become concession. Preparation is not hurried. Ethiopian forces gather deliberately, moving along routes refined by generations of trade and conflict. Food supplies are stockpiled locally, drawn from communities that understand what defeat would mean. Scouts observe Italian movements without revealing their own. Time, often the enemy of invading armies, becomes an ally. Every day, Italian columns advance inland. They stretch themselves thinner. Every day, Ethiopian forces concentrate. They grow stronger. From a distance, the disparity in equipment still looks decisive. Italian artillery is modern and standardized. Their command structure reflects European military doctrine. But doctrine assumes conditions: clear lines, reliable communication, predictable movement, that the highlands refuse to provide. Ethiopia's advantage lies not in overwhelming technology, but in alignment between land, leadership, and purpose. Menelik does not rush to confrontation. He allows the Italians to commit themselves fully, to cross points of no easy return. Diplomacy continues even as mobilization accelerates, offering Italy the chance to retreat without humiliation. These offers are dismissed or misunderstood. In Rome and in the field, confidence hardens into necessity. To withdraw now would be to admit doubt, and doubt is more dangerous to empire than defeat. What Europe cannot see is that Ethiopia is not improvising. It is executing a strategy grounded in survival. The empire has faced external threats before, though never one framed so explicitly in racial and ideological terms. This is not merely a dispute over borders. It is a confrontation with an idea that some nations are destined to rule and others to be ruled. As the two forces draw closer, the contrast becomes sharper. Italian commanders calculate engagements as they would in Europe, seeking decisive clashes under controlled conditions. Ethiopian leaders plan for absorption and encirclement, using numbers not as a blunt instrument, but as a means of denying the enemy coherence. Victory in this framework is not about annihilation. It is about breaking the structure that allows a smaller force to believe it can command the field. By early 1896, the highlands are no longer quiet. They hum with movement, men, animals, supplies, information, flowing toward a point that will soon bear a name known far beyond Ethiopia. The gathering is not chaotic. It is purposeful, shaped by authority that has been tested and renewed over decades. What Italian intelligence reports as disorder is, in reality, readiness. What European theory predicts as inevitable collapse is, in fact, convergence. The armies are moving toward one another not as representatives of two continents, but as embodiments of two incompatible assumptions about power. One side believes history advances in only one direction. The other is prepared to prove that it doesn't. The treaty is signed without ceremony, its pages thin and unremarkable, its language deceptively calm. In 1889, at a moment when Ethiopia seeks recognition and Italy seeks advantage, words are chosen that will later bear a weight neither side fully acknowledges. The Treaty of Wuchale appears, on the surface, to formalize friendship. In reality, it plants a fault line beneath the entire relationship. There are two versions of the same agreement. In the Amharic text, Ethiopia is permitted to conduct foreign relations through Italy if it chooses. In the Italian version, that choice becomes an obligation. The difference is subtle in form and catastrophic in consequence. Italy interprets the treaty as establishing Ethiopia as a protectorate, a claim it presents confidently to the European powers. Menelik does not discover the discrepancy immediately, but when he does, the response is unambiguous. Ethiopia will not accept a status it never agreed to. This is not merely a legal dispute. It is a collision between diplomatic cultures shaped by unequal expectations. Italy assumes that ambiguity favors the stronger party, that protest will be brief, and that pressure will resolve what translation cannot. Menelik understands that to accept Italy's interpretation would be to surrender sovereignty without a fight. The treaty becomes a mirror, reflecting how each side understands power, and how willing each is to defend its version of reality. Correspondence accelerates. Italian officials insist on their reading of the agreement, framing it as settled fact. Menelik replies with firmness, rejecting the protectorate claim outright. He informs European governments directly, bypassing Italy and asserting Ethiopia's independent standing. This move, diplomatic and strategic, undermines Italy's attempt to control the narrative. It is also a declaration: Ethiopia will not be spoken for. In Rome, frustration replaces confidence. To concede now would be to admit that Italy has misrepresented itself to Europe. The protectorate claim has already been announced. Walking it back would expose weakness. Domestic pressure mounts as critics question the cost and purpose of the African campaign. The solution, increasingly, is force, not as a last resort, but as a means of restoring credibility. Italian military preparations intensify under the assumption that resistance will collapse once confronted. Reports from the field that suggest otherwise are filtered through optimism. Ethiopian mobilization is acknowledged but discounted. The belief persists that once modern artillery speaks, diplomacy will become irrelevant. The treaty dispute, once a matter of interpretation, hardens into a justification for war. Menelik, meanwhile, makes one final attempt to avoid bloodshed. He proposes renegotiation, offering to reaffirm friendship without subordination. The offer is rejected. For Italy, the issue is no longer the treaty itself, but what it has come to represent. To yield would be to challenge the broader imperial order that assumes compliance from those it claims to protect. The collapse of diplomacy is not sudden. It unfolds through misreading, pride, and the inability of one side to imagine that the other might refuse. Each message exchanged narrows the space for compromise. Each mobilization makes restraint more costly. By the time Italian forces advance in earnest, the treaty has become irrelevant. Its purpose has been fulfilled, not as an agreement, but as a trigger. What follows is often described as inevitable, but inevitability here is manufactured. War emerges not from misunderstanding alone, but from the refusal to correct it. Italy chooses to enforce its interpretation through arms. Ethiopia chooses to defend its independence with everything it has prepared. As the armies move toward Adwa, the language of law gives way to the language of force. The dispute that began with a sentence becomes a confrontation that will be decided in terrain no treaty can control. Diplomacy has not failed because it was attempted. It has failed because one side assumed it could never truly be denied. The last messages cross paths in the highlands, carrying expectations that will soon be tested against reality. One side advances to confirm a claim. The other stands ready to reject it entirely. The night before the battle is restless. Italian columns move in darkness, guided by orders that depend on precision the terrain refuses to give. Valleys distort sound. Ridges conceal movement. Units drift apart, not dramatically, but just enough to matter. Command assumes cohesion. The land quietly dismantles it. At first light on March 1st, 1896, the Ethiopian highlands reveal an army that should not exist, at least not according to European expectation. Across the slopes near Adwa, tens of thousands of Ethiopian soldiers take shape, not as a single mass, but as coordinated forces converging with purpose. They are not charging blindly. They are maneuvering, closing gaps, exploiting separation. The battlefield is not chaotic. It is alive. Italian General Oreste Baratieri had not intended to fight here, not like this. His forces are spread across broken ground, their lines extended and vulnerable. Communication falters almost immediately. Orders arrive late or not at all. Artillery, meant to dominate from distance, struggles to find clear targets. The enemy does not present itself conveniently. It surrounds, absorbs, and advances from directions the maps did not predict. Ethiopian commanders move with an understanding shaped by terrain and timing. Ras Alula, Ras Makonnen, Ras Mikhail, leaders accustomed to independent action, coordinate without needing constant instruction. Their forces advance in waves, not reckless, not hesitant. Firepower answers firepower. Numbers are applied where they matter most, pressing against fractured Italian units that cannot support one another. What had been assumed as superiority begins to fracture into isolation. Italian brigades fight bravely, often desperately, but bravery cannot compensate for dislocation. Ammunition runs low. Retreat paths disappear. Attempts to regroup expose flanks. The battlefield becomes a series of collapsing positions rather than a single decisive line. Menelik remains removed from the immediate fighting, not detached, but deliberate. Command flows outward rather than downward, allowing momentum to build without interruption. This structure, so often dismissed by European observers as primitive, proves resilient under pressure. When one axis slows, another advances. When resistance stiffens, it is enveloped rather than broken head-on. By midday, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Italian losses mount rapidly. Entire units cease to function as commands. Some attempt withdrawal. Others are overrun before they can move. The modern army that arrived expecting confirmation of dominance finds itself unable to impose order on a battle it no longer controls. The defeat is not symbolic. It is absolute. Thousands of Italian soldiers are killed or captured. Artillery and supplies are abandoned. The campaign collapses in hours, not because Italy lacked courage, but because its assumptions proved incompatible with reality. Ethiopia does not win by miracle or chance. It wins by preparation, coordination, and the refusal to fight on terms imposed by someone else. When the fighting ends, the highlands fall quiet again. The land does not celebrate. It simply endures. What has changed is not the terrain, but the meaning now attached to it. Adwa is no longer a remote place on a colonial map. It is evidence. For the first time in the age of empire, a European army has been decisively defeated by an African state in a conventional battle. Not delayed, not negotiated away, defeated. The myth that had traveled with empire, that technology guaranteed victory, that resistance was temporary, lies broken among the ridges. News will take weeks to reach Europe, but the outcome is already irreversible. The belief that carried Italian forces into the highlands has collapsed under the weight of facts that can no longer be explained away. What remains is shock, silence, and a reckoning that will extend far beyond this battlefield. Adwa does not echo with triumphal speeches. It stands as a quiet rupture. where certainty met resistance and lost. The shock arrives in Europe before the understanding does. Headlines struggle to contain what has happened. Reports are questioned, then confirmed, then reprinted with disbelief. An Italian army has been destroyed, not delayed, not outmaneuvered into withdrawal, but defeated outright. In Rome, the news lands like a collapse of structure rather than a single blow. Confidence evaporates. Explanations multiply, none sufficient. The Italian government falls under the weight of the loss. Parliamentary inquiries search for errors that might confine the disaster to poor leadership or unfortunate circumstances. But beneath every argument lies a deeper anxiety, that the defeat cannot be neatly isolated. Adwa has not merely cost Italy soldiers and prestige, it has exposed a limit to the story Europe tells itself about power. In Ethiopia, the response is measured. There are no parades built for foreign audiences, no attempt to convert victory into spectacle. Menelik understands the fragility of the moment. Triumph invites reaction. Stability requires restraint. The Treaty of Addis Ababa follows, formally ending the war and recognizing Ethiopia's sovereignty. Italy renounces the protectorate claim it once asserted as fact. On paper, independence is affirmed. In reality, it has been defended. The consequences travel farther than the battlefield ever could. Across colonized and threatened societies, Adwa becomes a reference point, not as a blueprint for rebellion, but as proof that inevitability is an illusion. European observers begin to adjust their language. Theories of racial hierarchy, once presented as settled science, encounter an inconvenient fact they cannot erase. Ethiopia does not fit the narrative, and so the narrative must adapt or fracture. For the imperial powers, the lesson is uncomfortable. Military dominance is no longer assumed. It must be calculated, constrained, reconsidered. The cost of misjudgment has been made visible. Empire continues, but with a new awareness that resistance can be organized, armed, and successful. Adwa introduces doubt into a system that relies on certainty. Menelik's Ethiopia emerges not as an anomaly, but as a state that insisted on being recognized on its own terms. Its victory is not rooted in myth or exceptionalism, but in choices, diplomatic patience, strategic preparation, and the refusal to accept translations of power that erase agency. The world did not change overnight, but it shifted, just enough to matter. In the decades that follow, Adwa will be invoked, remembered, and sometimes simplified, but its core remains stubbornly factual. A European army advanced under the assumption of superiority. An African empire met it with organization and resolve. The outcome forced a reconsideration that no rhetoric could undo. The highlands returned to their quiet rhythms. The ridges that once concealed movement now hold memory. What happened here cannot be repeated exactly, and it does not need to be. Its significance lies not in replication, but in interruption. Adwa stands as a moment when history refused to proceed as predicted, when an empire defended itself and an assumption collapsed under its own certainty.